pension contributions to offset costs in two completely separate proposals, the highway bill and the payroll tax cut package for unemployment benefits and the dock fix. This isn't being honest with the American people. I would ask the Republican leadership to check their numbers again. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and oppose the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Outer Continental Shelf and the resources it contains are under the jurisdiction of the federal government and therefore belong to all the people of the United States as a whole. These federal offshore resources are, unlike federal lands and onshore resources, outside the borders of the states. Each individual state controls several miles offshore of their coast, and that varies state by state. But beyond that point, the federal lands are owned by the federal government and its resources. This bill, underlying legislation, is a drill smart plan that directly focuses on those offshore areas where there are known resources. Federal assessments estimate that the North Atlantic contains nearly 2 billion barrels of oil and nearly 18 trillion cubic feet of gas. Using modern technology, it's highly likely that the find could be even more than what is estimated. This amendment, then, would lock away those resources from the American people who, as I mentioned a moment ago, own them. Not too long ago, the entire OCS was under moratoria. Offshore drilling in this country was prohibited. When the gas skyrocketed past $4 a gallon in 2008, the American people collectively said, no more. The American people cried out and demanded that Congress act, and we did by lifting the moratorium. In fact, what the American people found out, Mr. Chairman, at that time is that we had tremendous potential resources here that we weren't utilizing. That's why they cried out and said, okay, let's end the several moratoria. Now, this amendment proposes to reverse the will of the American people, to ignore the high cost of gas at the pump, to ignore that prices again are climbing towards $4 per gallon, and to ignore that our nation's security is strengthened when we get our energy from here in this nation and not from hostile foreign nations. The American people want to increase American energy production and jobs, not stifle American energy production. Let's not forget that we are creating American oil and gas that can be refined and used here. And some of the states that want to shut down production off their coasts are some of the states that are the highest consumers of these fuels that they would have shut down. Additionally, this amendment completely eliminates all coastal states and U.S. territories from receiving a fair and equitable revenue for drilling that would occur off their shores. That means states like Florida and Virginia and others that would like to participate could not receive a portion of the revenues for drilling that would occur off their states under this bill. And finally, I would like to say this, because we've had a long discussion today and debate, and I've heard my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say, we love natural gas. I'm not sure if it was said with that same cadence, but the message was there. Listen, Mr. Chairman, nearly 18 trillion cubic feet of natural gas lies off the Atlantic coast. Can you imagine how much easier it is to get that to market than shipping it from someplace else? So I would urge rejection of this amendment, and I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time I have left?
The gentleman from New York has 3.5 minutes remaining.
Yield
3 minutes remaining. My apologies.
Yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Maine, Ms. Pingree.
The gentlelady from Maine is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Bishop, thank you for allowing me this time. This amendment would prohibit any oil and gas drilling on the Outer Continental Shelf in the Northeast, including my home state in Maine. An accident or a spill off our coast would be devastating to our working waterfronts. We don't have to look any further than the Deepwater Horizon disaster to see the damage an accident could do to a coastal economy. Not only that, but it would be decades before any oil that is discovered would ever make it to market. Decades that should be spent researching and investing in new sources of clean energy and breaking our dependence on oil. The Republican proposals in this bill would not only carelessly expand the permitting for current gas and oil leases, but also encourage expanded drilling. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this common-sense amendment and voting against this ill-conceived bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I will reserve my time since I have a right to close.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close as well, so I will yield myself the balance of my time. And I would just say to my friend from Washington that I would find his argument and I would find the statistics that he cited somewhat more persuasive if this Congress had enacted any reforms, any safeguards to protect our coastline from the kind of disaster that affected the Louisiana and the Florida coast in the wake of the BP oil spill. We have not put in place a single piece of legislation that would make offshore drilling safer. We have not put in place a single piece of legislation designed to prevent the kind of disaster that took place in the Gulf. We are continuing to rely on the sort of slipshod environmental reviews that preceded the granting of leases in the Gulf, and I think to expose certainly my region, Ms. Pingree's region, to the kind of disaster that the Gulf was exposed to without putting in place those safeguards, simply unwise, not worth $4.3 billion to fund a bill that most of us feel is a very flawed bill to begin with. So I would urge adoption of my amendment. As I say, I would urge defeat of the underlying legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have?
The gentleman from Washington has 1.25 minutes remaining.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman is recognized.
2 points, Mr. Chairman. First of all, the gentleman suggests that this Congress and this House, led by Republicans, have not done anything as far as safety offshore. I would just remind the gentleman that through the appropriation process there has been a tremendous increase in precisely what the administration was asking by the Obama administration was asking for safety. And the Obama administration has said essentially that it is safe, although I would argue they should be more aggressive, but they say it's safe to drill. So that argument I don't think really has a great deal of bearing. But more importantly, I would say this. The Port of Boston has a liquid natural gas terminal, and they are importing natural gas from Trinidad and Yemen, hardly a stable community or country in the Middle East. And right now, right off the coast of Nova Scotia, just north of this area that we're talking about, there is natural gas drilling going on. So certainly, if we want to be less dependent on foreign oil or foreign energy, and we like natural gas, like a lot of my friends on the other side of the aisle have talked about, then we should reject this amendment and adopt the underlying bill. And with that, I urge rejection of this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
All time having expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker,
the gentleman from New York.
On that I request the yeas and nays.
The gentleman requests a recorded vote.
Yes, I request a recorded vote.
The gentleman from New York requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 10, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 10, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-398, offered by Mr. Richmond of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Mr. Chairman, what this amendment what it simply does is it allows those Gulf Coast states to invest their oil and gas royalties into their states in terms of coastal restoration. And I would tell you, Mr. Speaker, that Louisiana, since 1950, has contributed over $160 billion to the federal treasury. And in return, Louisiana has received some of the same benefits as other states have received. However, one unique thing that we've received is a tattered coastline. Louisiana loses almost a football field an hour in terms of our wetland loss. And what this bill, this amendment would do is allow us to take some of those revenues that we receive and invest that back into restoring our coast. I will tell you also, Mr. Chairman, that restoring Louisiana's coast is a very monumental task. And the people of Louisiana, the people of all the Gulf Coast communities, are willing to step up and take not only their own resources, but resources they receive from the federal government in terms of any revenues or royalties they will receive, and put those back into coastal restoration, making sure that we have wetlands. Because when we talk about the damage that has been done to Louisiana, whether it was Katrina, Rita, Gustav or Ike, or the BP Deep Horizon oil spill, that event cost us 11 Louisiana citizens. Katrina, Rita, and all of those cost the Gulf Coast community almost the lives of 1,600 of its citizens. So when we talk about our wetlands, that's our first line of defense of preventing the damage of a hurricane. So while we are willing to sacrifice our coast and those things so that we can have a stable energy sector in this country, we also recognize that we should invest back in it to make sure that the citizens are safe. And with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Louisiana reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition, although I'm not opposed to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes without objection.
I give myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the gentleman from Louisiana's proposal has merit, and I commend him for proposing it, and I do urge its adoption. The goal of revenue sharing in the bill is to allow states the flexibility to use the money that they want to do with their local states. If this is what the gentleman's state wants to use this money for, I have no problem, and I certainly agree with him. In fact, I would emphasize one other point. Since I've had an opportunity to visit the gentleman's states and I see firsthand what they have done with the initiative. And I think that is a tremendous template for other states to do, and that is precisely why in the underlying bill we have the component of revenue sharing for other states to maybe emulate what Louisiana has always done. So I think the gentleman's amendment certainly is compatible with what we're trying to do, and I think it's a good amendment, and I commend the gentleman for that, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would just simply close by thanking the gentleman and saying that what the amendment does is really allow the Gulf Coast communities to invest in our own future while continuing to invest in the energy future of America. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 11, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 11, printed in Part A of House Report number 112-398, offered by Mr. Landry of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Landry, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Mr. Chairman, this is a bipartisan amendment offered in cooperation with my good friend, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cedric Richmond. As he said earlier, Louisianians invented offshore drilling exploration and have been drilling off its coast ever since the mid-1940s. But for the first 60 years of drilling off the coast of Louisiana, our state and other Gulf Coast states had received no money, not a dime, from the revenue derived from these wells. Starting in 2007, Congress passed an act called the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act. This act provided that a small portion of offshore revenues would finally start to trickle in to our Gulf Coast states. Those of us in the Gulf Coast states will continue to receive a small portion of those revenues through 2017 when, at that time, we will start to receive the 37.5% of the offshore revenue of each of those wells producing at that time. However, in GOMESA, it included a cap, which collectively those 4 Gulf Coast states could never receive more than a collective amount of $500 million. As the current bill now is going to provide revenue sharing for additional states without a cap, we're simply asking for fundamental fairness here and asking that the cap of $500 million be raised to $750 million. And that's what this amendment does. This amendment simply raises the collective cap amongst those 4 states from 500 to 750, reminding everyone that that there will be no cap on the additional states. I yield back and reserve the balance of my time. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Louisiana reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If this amendment passes, Mardi Gras will come on the Wednesday before Fat Tuesday this year. That's because the Landry Amendment delivers up to $6 billion in a financial king cake to Louisiana and the other Gulf states at the expense of the other 46 states in the Union. In 2006, the Republican Congress passed legislation that will divert $150 billion over the next 60 years from offshore drilling on public lands to the 4 Gulf Coast states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. That bill set up what amounts to a new entitlement program for these 4 states that will result in a massive transfer of wealth from the federal government. This amendment would send $6 billion to these 4 states on top of that $150 billion they will already be getting. These oil and gas resources on public lands belong to all the American people, not just those of the adjacent states. They are public resources that belong as much to someone living in Kansas or Massachusetts or Hawaii as they do to someone in Louisiana or Texas. These are resources that should help every American, not just a select few. The revenue generated from these public resources goes to the Federal Treasury to help pay for Medicare and Medicaid. It helps to pay for our national defense. We can no longer afford to continue this diversion of taxpayer funds to these 4 states. We need this revenue to reduce our deficit and get our fiscal house in order. I had offered an amendment that would have recovered the $150 billion we are going to be sending to these 4 states that the majority did not make in order. And now this amendment would take us in the complete opposite direction. So I commend the gentleman from Louisiana. I can't blame him for trying to get even more federal money directed to his home state under this program. But if you come from one of the 46 states that is not, let me enumerate them again, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, or Texas, you would have to be crazy to vote for this amendment because they're going to take money away from your states, away from your Medicare beneficiaries, away from your contribution to the defense budget, because it will be higher in all those other states because this money is going to be sucked out of the Federal Treasury like through a straw right into the state of Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. So if you vote for this amendment, you are voting to send that money, $6 billion, directly from your state to the gentleman from Louisiana's state. I urge all members of the Louisiana delegation to vote against the Markey Amendment. And I would give a similar recommendation to the other members from the other 3 states. But if you don't come from one of those 4 states, why would you send $6 billion to those states that should be in the federal treasury to be used for all the citizens of our country? At this point, I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
How much time, Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have?
The gentleman from Louisiana has 3 minutes remaining.
I would like to yield a minute to the chairman of Natural Resources from Washington.
The gentleman from
Doc
Washington
Hastings.
is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just point out the underlying bill vastly expands the number of states that be eligible for revenue sharing to far beyond those 4 states that the ranking member mentioned. But when our committee held a markup on this legislation 2 weeks ago, I pledged to work with the gentleman from Louisiana and Gulf members to help bring parity to the differences between the existing revenue sharing currently enjoyed in the 4 Gulf states and all the other coastal states, who up until this legislation today, as I mentioned, were not entitled to a share of revenue from oil and gas production off those shores. Let me repeat again. Under this legislation, more states will have an opportunity to share this. But this amendment seeks to bring existing revenue sharing in the Gulf to more in line with the plan that was included with the underlying bill, and I congratulate the gentleman for bringing this amendment to the floor. I support it, and with that, I yield back my time to the gentleman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
I would like to yield a minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the gentleman from Louisiana. I have to stand and differ from my good friend and colleague from Massachusetts. He's absolutely right when he says the resources are everyone's. The resources are everyone's. But the sacrifice that you make to get those resources comes from those Gulf states. We lost 18,036 lives in Katrina. We lost 11 lives in the BP oil spill. We've lost 328 square miles of marsh. And in this bill, we give royalties to all the other states immediately. What we're asking from Louisiana is that without a cap, what we're asking is that in 2016, when we start to, actually 2023, to give us the 37.5%. However, we're willing to cap it at $750 million, as opposed to the unlimited amount that all the other states under this bill would do. And then I think in 2006, Congress recognized that the Gulf Coast states were bearing the brunt of our energy production in this country. The lands that we lose, we produce 90% of the nation's offshore oil and gas. So that's a sacrifice that we make for people in Kansas, people in California, to be able to turn on their lights in the afternoon or at nighttime. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would urge members to, Mr. Chairman, to vote for the amendment, and I yield back the balance of the time.
Time has expired. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized. The gentleman from Louisiana has 1 minute remaining.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll just close with this. As the gentleman from Louisiana just indicated, 30% of all oil and gas produced in this country comes off of Louisiana shores. A quarter of all the seafood is caught in Louisiana. In Louisiana, we have made it a constitutional amendment that any revenue we receive from the federal government or offshore royalties goes to coastal protection and the building of the coast that we are so rapidly losing. And again, this is not an amendment whereby we're asking for more of our share. We are simply asking to raise a cap when other states will have no cap. This is only fundamental fairness here. And I certainly would urge all members to consider that and to please support this amendment when it comes to the floor. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. All time having expired, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from Massachusetts.
On that, we request a recorded vote.
The gentleman from Massachusetts requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 12, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 12, printed in Part A of House Report number 112-398, offered by Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, nearly 2 years ago, an explosion on the BP Deepwater Horizon drilling vessel unleashed a steady gush of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico that went unstopped for 3 full months. The 4.9 million barrels of crude oil spewed into the Gulf and jeopardized an ecosystem home to over 15,000 species and claimed the mantle as the worst environmental disaster in our nation's history. Yet the BP Deepwater Horizon spill was also an economic disaster. And, Mr. Chairman, that is the issue addressed in the amendment I present to this body today. My amendment simply provides that no one shall be eligible for a lease issued unless there is first an estimate of the economic impact, including job losses, resulting from a worst-case discharge of oil from facilities operated under that lease. Right now, under current law and under this legislation as drafted, companies applying for new oil drilling leases are not required to project the toll on local economies resulting from a worst-case scenario spill. In my home state of Florida and in other Gulf Coast states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, the economic consequences were enormous. Forced closures of fishing areas led to shutter businesses. Fewer tourists led to job losses. The powerful economic ripple effect was felt by millions of Americans in states whose coastal towns, cities, and businesses depend on the livelihood of tourism, fishing, restaurant, shrimping, and other industries. The bill before us today would open large areas of the Gulf of Mexico, the east and west coast of the United States, and areas in Alaska to oil drilling. Opening these areas to drilling exposes the coastal communities and coastal states to significant economic impact and job losses should a large-scale oil spill like the one in the BP Deepwater Horizon occur. And while BP created a $20 billion recovery fund to assist communities devastated by the spill, litigation over the total cost continues today, as BP seeks financial contributions from Deepwater Horizon contractors for payout of claims. Estimates of the spill's total economic impact are upwards of $40 billion and more. The federal government has a real interest in ensuring that companies applying for new oil drilling leases are aware of and are prepared for the potential economic impact and job losses resulting from a worst-case scenario spill. It only makes sense that these applications require an economic in addition to an environmental estimate of such disasters. My amendment, therefore, would require the person to include in their application this estimate of economic impact arising from a worst-case discharge of oil from the facilities. I urge my colleagues to join me in safeguarding our economy from tragedies like the Deepwater Horizon spill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington seeks recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, since the Deepwater Horizon tragedy, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement have put forward significant regulatory measures governing offshore drilling. This is very important, Mr. Chairman, because existing federal regulations, specifically 30 CFR 254.26, already require a worst-case discharge scenario. So that's in the law already, Mr. Chairman. In all lease applications, that includes the evaluation of economic resources that may be impacted. So I find it interesting that we have an amendment before us and that we are debating on essentially legislation and regulatory issues that are already currently in place. Now let me make another point to hopefully sometimes point out the disconnect of what we're talking about, because one of the issues that we are talking about here are the creation of American energy, American jobs, American security, less dependence on foreign sources of our energy. This last January, for example, the State Department expelled the Consul General of Venezuela in Miami for plotting a cyber attack on the U.S. government. And yet, here we are debating an issue that could affect our getting to be less dependent on foreign energy sources and ignoring what is the obvious. We ought to be obviously trying to be less dependent on foreign oil. And yet, that debate isn't even going on. We're talking about a debate on an amendment that is simply redundant of current law. Now, I don't know why we're having this debate, but I think the redundance of it here, we always have a worst-case discharge scenario in current law. We simply don't need this. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge opposition to this amendment, and I'll reserve my time in case I have to say something further.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentleman from Florida has 2 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman from Washington I respect a great deal, but to say that this is redundant of current law is just incorrect. The gentleman knows and in fact told us that the requirement that he referred to is in regulations. Mr. Chairman, for anyone who's watched what's gone on in this body, in this Congress, it has been this House of Representatives that has brought to the floor bill after bill after bill to give this Congress the ability to repeal regulations, to block regulations. Mr. Chairman, I don't want to have to rely on what's in regulations if we believe in American jobs. And the suggestion that somehow the American jobs in the energy industry are more important than the American jobs in the tourism industry and the shrimpers and the people in tourism and who realize every day the opportunity to provide for their families because of the beautiful, pristine coastline that we have in Florida and because of all that surrounds the environment in the other states in the Gulf, to suggest that those are somehow less important than energy jobs is inappropriate. But more than that, I don't want to have to rely on regulations, Mr. Chairman, if we are committed to ensuring that there is an analysis of what would happen in the worst case. Then let's put it in the law. Let's put it in this statute. Let's not rely on the regulations that my friends so often blame on these bureaucrats for writing. Let's not rely on them. Here's an opportunity for us to stand together and not want to rely on regulations. Mr. Chairman, I ask my colleagues to join with me to, as they already have acknowledged that this is an important issue, to not have to rely on regulations any longer. Let's make this a part of the law. I reserve.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Well, Mr. Chairman, since I have the right to close, I will reserve.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Florida has 15 seconds remaining.
Mr. Chairman, there are lots of amendments that are controversial. Simply requiring that companies do what the regulations require them to do, which my colleague from Washington acknowledges they're already required to do, but making it a part of the law instead of requiring on regulations that may change from time to time is the appropriate step. I think we should all be in agreement on that, and I urge the adoption of this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, from time to time there shows really progress in the course of debate. The gentleman from Florida correctly pointed out that my side of the aisle has some real heartburn on a lot of regulations. I will be the first to admit that. Apparently he does too, by his acknowledgement that we have that acknowledgement, and he doesn't want to be governed by regulations. So I think we're making progress, at least in that way, and I congratulate him. But here's the point. On this specific issue, this Congress has responded, and to the credit, this administration has responded, probably not to the extent that I would like, seeing that the regulatory oversight on potential spills in the Gulf or any place off in the OCS will be responded to in a timely manner. That was done through the appropriation process by a Republican-led Congress. I congratulate the Chairman of the Interior Subcommittee on Appropriations for doing precisely that. But I'll repeat again, in my view, in this particular case, This amendment is redundant to what the law through regulations already is, and I would urge rejection of this amendment. With that, I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back, all time having expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from Florida.
I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman from Florida requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part A of House Report 112-398, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 1 by Ms. Eshoo of California. Amendment number 2 by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts. Amendment number 3 by Mr. Rush of Illinois. Amendment number 4 by Mr. Doyle of Pennsylvania. Amendment number 5 by Mr. Polis of Colorado. Amendment number 7 by Ms. Capps of California. Amendment number 9 by Mr. Bishop of New York. Amendment number 11 by Mr. Landry of Louisiana. And amendment number 12 by Mr. Deutsch of Florida. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in the series. The unfinished business is the request for recorded vote on Amendment number 1, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398 by the gentleman from California, Ms. Eshoo, on which further proceedings were postponed and in which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part A of House Report number 112-398, offered by Ms. Eshoo of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
A series of 9 amendment votes on the House floor. They've been spending much of the afternoon talking about drilling for oil and gas, the Alaska Arctic Wildlife Refuge, the Keystone XL pipeline. But it's all part of the transportation package. Yesterday, House Republican leaders decided to split up the transportation bill in an effort to overcome opposition to some of the provisions in the bill. The White House has already threatened to veto the package over some concerns about highway safety provisions and also about the energy and drilling provisions that were debated this afternoon. This is the First Amendment vote. This is Anna Eshoo, Democrat of California, with an amendment that would require the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to review the results of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration as part of the discussion issuing of a permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. This First Amendment vote is 15 minutes. All of the remaining 8 amendment votes will be 2-minute votes. Earlier today, we spoke to a Capitol Hill reporter for some further details on the transportation bill. Joining us is Nathan Hurst with Congressional Quarterly. Why did House Republicans split this surface transportation bill into 3 separate parts?
Well, they were looking at some real trouble getting the policy and finance titles of the bill moved as a whole. So they made the decision in Rules Committee Tuesday night to take a look at splitting it back up into 3 different titles, specifically so they could look at all of the hundreds of amendments that had come up in a more palatable way and also be able to wrangle the votes they needed to get this legislation passed.
The portion they'll be dealing with today deals with expanding oil and gas drilling. So what does that cover?
Well, that covers a big part of the pay-for mechanism of H.R. 7, the combined bill. Not only does it cover offshore oil and gas drilling in places like the Gulf of Mexico, but there's also an opening up of the Anwar Reserve, which has been a big controversy in Alaska. But it would also provide, again, a lot of the pay-for money for this bill since there's no will to raise the gas tax to pay for it.
A number of lawmakers will be allowed to offer amendments related to the Keystone XL pipeline. How are they seeking to change the bill?
Well, they basically want to take on language that we've already seen the House trying to move separately and as amendments to other bills that would essentially circumvent executive branch review of the Keystone XL pipeline and provide a congressional approval for that project, which has been a big goal of the GOP in the latter half of the session.
The second part of the financing portion of this legislation deals with government pensions. What are Republican leaders trying to do there?
Well, this has actually ended up being quite an issue overnight because we've had the transportation bill moving forward at the same time as the payroll tax cut extension legislation. And it ended up that there had been a deal struck to use that same pay-for the payroll tax extension as was being proposed for H.R. 7, the transportation bill. So this morning, one of House Speaker John Boehner's top aides came out saying it looks like we're going to have to perhaps push back some of the debate on this and it possibly spill over into the week after the President's Day recess, because now that pay-for has already been spoken for on the payroll tax side, they're going to have to be searching for more dollars to fund the transportation bill.
Summing it all up, though, how much money would be raised between these two financing pieces, the proposed pension piece, the drilling piece?
Well, it would actually cover about half the cost of the bill. When you're looking at the transportation funding, you've got the same gas tax rate of a little more than 18 cents per gallon that you've had in place since 1993. That provides about $35 billion a year, depending on how you look at it. And the cost of the bill is more in the $50 to $60 billion range. So you've got about $20 billion a year that needs to be covered. So we're looking at more than $100 billion between these to cover transportation costs.
And the overall cost of this 5-year bill?
$250 billion.
Over in the Senate today, it looks like they're going to move forward working on the transportation measure. How different is that bill there?
That's a 2-year bill, much narrower in scope, and it was really the prime product of Senator Boxer from California. So it's very much a Democrat-driven bill. There's no oil and pipeline pay-fors there. The pay-fors actually came out of the Finance Committee, where Senator Max Baucus kind of gave Republicans a large menu of options that they could pick from. And you've got everything from some tax sunsets for the paper industry, and some other smaller offsets. One proposal is to revoke passports of tax scofflaws to force people to pay up and basically drive that money back into the transportation bill. But again, it's only a 2-year bill. Typically, when we've been looking at highway reauthorizations since the start of the interstate system, when this was really the way that the legislation moves forward, you're looking at 6-year bills. So this is the shortest term bill that we were looking at. It has a $109 billion cost, which right now, given the fact that there's an insistence upon paying for everything and not adding to the deficit, it seems at least a little more viable to get some bipartisan buy-in. But as we're seeing in the Budget Committee this morning, and also some finance portions that were marked up earlier this month, there's still some consternation there as far as how you're going to get that $12 billion gap, which is what you're seeing on the Senate bill.
Covering the transportation debate on Capitol Hill, Nathan Hurst with Congressional Quarterly. Read more at CQ.com. Thanks for the update.
Absolutely.
And by mid-afternoon today, the Senate had moved on to begin debate on their transportation bill. You can follow that now on our companion network, C-SPAN 2. Here on C-SPAN, the first of 9 amendment votes to the part of the transportation package the House is debating, part focusing on expanding oil and gas drilling, including the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and approving the Keystone XL pipeline. This is Anna Eshu's proposed amendment. It's a 15-minute vote, and all of the remaining amendments will get 2-minute votes. President Obama left Washington today and headed out to Milwaukee. He spoke today at the Master Lock Company in Milwaukee, talking about jobs and not stopping rewarding businesses that ship their jobs overseas. He also urged Congress to send him his proposed tax reforms and urged Congress as well to come to an agreement on extending the payroll tax cuts. We're going to show you a short portion of the President's comments from earlier today in Milwaukee. It's about 10 minutes.
That Congress seems to be on the way of making progress on extending the payroll tax cuts so taxes don't go up on all of you and 160 million working Americans. You know, this tax cut means that the typical American family will see an extra $40 in every paycheck this year. And that's going to help speed up this recovery. It'll make a real difference in the lives of millions of people. And as soon as Congress sends me that extension of tax cuts and unemployment insurance to my desk, I will sign it right away. We're going to get that signed. I love you back. But that's only a start. There's a lot more we can do. A lot more we have to do to help create jobs and bring back manufacturing and middle-class security to Milwaukee and Wisconsin and the United States of America. Look, well, and we've got examples of success. When I took office, a lot of UAW workers here, you guys remember this. When I took office, the American auto industry was on the verge of collapse. And there were some folks who said we should let it die. With 1 million jobs at stake, I refuse to let that happen. I refuse to let that happen. We said in exchange for help, we're going to demand responsibility. We got workers and automakers to settle their differences. We got the industry to restructure and retool, come up with better designs. Today, the American auto industry is back, and General Motors is once again the #1 automaker in the world. Chrysler's grown faster in the U.S. than any major car company. Ford is investing billions in U.S. plants and equipment and factories. And altogether, over the past 2 years, the entire industry has added nearly 160,000 jobs, well-paying jobs. What's happening in Detroit can happen in other industries. What happens in Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Raleigh and Milwaukee, that's what we've got to be shooting for, is to create opportunities for hard-working Americans to get in there and start making stuff again and sending it all over the world. Products stamped with 3 proud words, made in America. That's our goal. And that's what's happening right here at Master Lock, because of you. Over the last few years, it's become more expensive to do business in countries like China. Meanwhile, American workers, we've become even more productive. So when John Hefner was at the White House in January, he told me how it makes more business sense for Master Lock to bring jobs back home here to Milwaukee. And today, for the first time in 15 years, this plant is running at full capacity. And that's an example of what happens when unions and employers work together to create good jobs. Today, you're selling products directly to customers in China, stamped with those words, made in America. And the good news is this is starting to happen around the country. For the first time since 1990, American manufacturers are creating new jobs. That's good for the companies, but it's also good up and down the supply chain. Because if you're making this stuff here, that means that there are producers and suppliers in and around the area who have a better chance of selling stuff here. means the restaurant close by suddenly has more customers. Everybody benefits when manufacturing is going strong. So you all have heard enough about outsourcing. More and more companies like Master Lock are now insourcing, deciding that if the cost of doing business here isn't too much different than the cost of doing business in places like China, then why wouldn't you rather do it right here in the United States of America? Why not? Why not put some Americans to work? Companies would rather bet on the country with the best colleges and universities to train workers with new skills and produce cutting-edge research. They'd rather place their bet on the nation with the greatest array of talent and ingenuity, the country with the greatest capacity for innovation that the world has ever known. Now, during the State of the Union, I issued a challenge to America's business leaders, folks like John. I said, ask yourself what you can do to bring jobs back to your country, and your country will do everything we can to help you succeed. And since then, a number of companies, large and small, domestic, but also even some foreign companies, have said they now plan to open new facilities and create new jobs right here in America, which is still the largest market on earth. These include Wisconsin companies like Diamond Precision, which is a machine manufacturer that's going to be adding dozens of jobs here in Milwaukee. A company that's growing because its customers are choosing to buy American-made products instead of supplies from China. There's a company called Collaborative Consulting, an information technology company that wants to open a new call center here in Wausau. And across the nation, there are well-known companies like Caterpillar that are planning to bring jobs back home. So last month we decided to hold a summit. That's where John was at. A summit at the White House so we could hear from companies like these who've decided to insource jobs. We wanted to learn how can we accelerate this trend. And this last fall, for the first time, we'll be bringing companies from around the world together with governors and mayors and other leaders to discuss the benefits of investing and creating more jobs here in the United States. So our job as a nation is to do everything we can to make the decision to insource more attractive for more companies. That's our top priority. That's our top priority. We've got to seize this moment of opportunity. We can't let it slip away. We've got an opportunity to create new American jobs and American manufacturing, put that back where it needs to be. Now, one place to start is with our tax code. I talked about this a little bit at the State of the Union. Right now, companies get tax breaks for moving jobs and profits overseas. They're taking deductions for the expenses of moving out of the United States. Meanwhile, companies that are doing the right thing and choosing to stay here, they get hit with one of the highest tax rates in the world. That doesn't make sense. Everybody knows it doesn't make sense. Politicians of both parties have been talking about changing it for years. So my message to Congress is, don't wait. Get it done. Do it now. Let's get it done. As Congress thinks about tax reform principles, there's some basic things they can do. First, if you're a business that wants to outsource jobs, you have that right, but you shouldn't get a tax deduction for doing it. That money should be used to cover moving expenses for companies like Master Lock that decide to bring jobs home. Give them the tax break. Second of all, no American company should be able to avoid paying its fair share of taxes by moving jobs and profits overseas. So we've said from now on, every multinational company should have to pay a basic minimum tax. And every penny should go towards lowering taxes for companies that choose to stay and hire here in the United States of America. Give them a bigger tax break. Third, if you're an American manufacturer, you should get a bigger tax cut. If you're a high-tech manufacturer, creating new products, new services, we should double the tax deduction you get for making products here in America. If you want to relocate in a community like this one, that's been hard hit when factories left town, you should get help financing a new plant, financing new equipment, training new workers. It is time to stop rewarding companies that ship jobs overseas and start rewarding companies that are creating jobs right here in the United States of America. And this Congress should send me these tax reforms right now. I will sign them right away. Right now. Right now. Right now.
President Obama from earlier today at the Masterlock Company in Milwaukee. You can see all of that later in our program schedule, also in the video library at cspan.org. The president heads to California for a couple of campaign fundraiser events. This is an amendment by California Representative Anna Eshoo. It's one of the 9 amendments that the House will vote on this evening. Related to part of the transportation bill, the part that deals with expanding oil and gas drilling and approval of the Keystone XL pipeline. Her amendment deals with a study, a hazardous pipeline and hazardous material safety study. This is a 15-minute vote, and the remaining amendment votes will all be 9-minute votes. You heard the president mention in his comments there the payroll tax cut extension. Earlier today, it appeared that there might be some sort of a vote by the end of the week. The news was that House Republicans were saying that they expect a vote by late this week, by Friday of this week. That is still sort of up in the air. We spoke just a short while ago to a Capitol Hill reporter for some details on where things stand on the negotiations over the payroll tax cut. Siobhan Hughes covers Congress for Dow Jones Newswires. You wrote earlier this afternoon that Speaker Boehner said he expected the chamber to vote this week on a payroll tax cut extension package, but that a hiccup had emerged today over how to cover the cost of extending jobless benefits. What's that hiccup?
The hiccup has to do with how do you pay for it. Negotiators thought they had a deal. They thought that auctioning off some of the federal spectrum combined with having federal workers contribute a little bit more to their pensions was going to be enough. But as people started looking at it, there's some question as to whether or not the spectrum auction is going to raise as much money as people had hoped. So the question is, how do you fill in that gap? The Maryland lawmakers are really powerful players in this, and a lot of people don't want federal workers, their constituents in Maryland, to have to give any more. So that's not a very good option for a lot of important players. There had also been a discussion about adding yet again fees that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would pass along to lenders every time you get a home mortgage, but that's not a good idea to a lot of people because housing is already struggling, and so why are you going to use that as the fix, the same thing you did last time around? So the question is, what is the way forward? As you dig a little bit deeper into this, spectrum also gets to be a very politicized issue because the way the bill is written could potentially determine AT&T's ability to bid on a lot of the spectrum. That's intertwined with how much money the auctions raise. The way auctions are designed affects the revenues that come in. So you've got a bunch of moving pieces, and it's still very much a fight that has not sorted out yet.
Assuming they figure out a way to pay for it, what have you heard about the length of the extension?
The length of the extension would be until the end of the year. That's a full 10 months on each of the three provisions, the extension of the payroll tax cut, the so-called doc fix, which avoids a cut in Medicare reimbursements to doctors who serve Medicare patients, and then also the extended jobless benefits up until the end of the year. The jobless benefits, however, would not be quite as generous as they are today.
What can you tell us about how they plan to resolve the Medicare payments to doctors? How will that change?
For doctors, it would be pretty good. They're going to avoid that 27.4% cut, and the agreement would extend through the end of the year. Payment rates for Medicare doctors. The issue is paying for it, and they're going to pay for it by cutting into some of the Obamacare programs, which is a politicized issue for a lot of Democrats. That's something that's a little bit hard for them to swallow.
So as we stand here late afternoon on Wednesday, any idea of when they're hoping to get this resolved? And secondly, when we might see this voted on in the House and Senate?
Mr. Boehner implied this morning that he really wanted this voted on by Friday, and Senate aides have implied that they want to take it up shortly after. People want to clear this off their plates before the recess next week. For that to happen, it looks like it's going to be a very, very late night, and it's not clear when we're going to see that paper.
An update on the payroll tax cut discussion. Siobhan Hughes with Dow Jones Newswires. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And no updated news on the payroll tax cut negotiations. Here on the House floor, this is the first of 9 amendment votes to a measure, part of the transportation, the 5-year transportation bill, and a part that would expand oil and gas drilling, would approve the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a 15-minute vote winding down. The remaining 8 votes will be 2-minute votes.
Vote. The yeas are 173, the nays are 249. The amendment